Okay, great. So let's get going. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the Nonprofit Management TA series. This is the first of 4 total technical series sessions in this series, and the date for those will be coming soon. So definitely stay tuned. This series is funded through the CDC, but the information shared today and for the rest of these sessions are from the speakers. And these sessions are made to be a platform for peer sharing. So my name is Miriam Rodriguez, and I am the Senior Coalition Relations Coordinator with USBC. And I'm going to be starting our intro today. Just let me pull that up. Okay, great. So just to go over a couple of key pieces before we get started. Today's session is the nonprofit operations session. We will have 45 minutes to cover a range of questions that you all submitted. And thank you so much for those questions. If you have any additional questions as we move through our slides, please add them to the chat box and we'll try our best to address them. This session is going to cover different topics from nonprofit status to governance and organizational structure. And for those of you who ask specific questions regarding funding, participation, membership, or communications, we will be covering these in other sessions. There was also some questions that were a little bit beyond these topics, and those will not be covered in this series at this time. Finally, we will have a satisfaction survey at the end of this session, so please remember to participate in this and the link to the resources that we covered today will be on there, so don't forget to do that. And to get us started, we do have a number of polls today, so we're going to try one out today right now. Oh, I'm sorry. Just one second. So we can go ahead and do that. Now, just one second. And I see that somebody joined as operations. I'm gonna ask you to, actually, I think I just fixed it. One second, technical difficulties. Oh man.
Miriam, I think I can launch the poll. Shall I try that?
Yeah, great.
Okay. I'm just going to quickly go out of order and introduce myself. Linda Kopecki. I'm one of the presenters today, or the facilitators of this conversation today, and I'll introduce myself a little bit more, but I'm going to launch the poll. So here you go. We're just wondering, is your organization or coalition a dues paying member of USBC? Okay, everybody's answered. And the majority, yes, dues paying member of USBC.
Great, thank you so much, Linda. And now you can go ahead and actually introduce yourself and I'll pass it to you and Stephanie to get us going through the rest of the slide.
Okay, and I'll turn on my camera, at least for my introduction. So hi, everybody, Linda Kopecki here. I'm looking at the names, and I know some of you very well, some of you a little bit, and some of you, this is the first time I've met you. So I'm really excited to be in the same room. I've been calling these TA sessions sort of office hours. So thanks for dropping into our office, our virtual office, to talk about nonprofit operations. My background is public health and lactation and community engagement. And somehow I've been able to combine all those. And I'm also the interim executive director of the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition. But the hat I'm wearing here is as a contractor with USBC and providing leadership for this technical assistance series. And I'm super excited to have Stephanie Hutchinson as my partner in crime for these office hours. So Stephanie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Like Linda said, I see so many familiar names, but some that I haven't seen before. So I do want to introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Hutchinson. I am the founder and president of Appalachian Breastfeeding Network, which is a 501c3 organization. So makes sense that we would be here to talk to you all about your questions with, taking your coalition to a 501c3. It's a process. One thing that I did want to share is that whenever I started in this journey of 501c3, I decided to go back to school and get my MBA, specifically in nonprofit management. So it has helped tremendously with a lot of these questions that you have. So I'm very, very happy to be here today. I live in Southeast Ohio on the border of West Virginia. So sometimes my internet can be a little wonky. So I probably will have my video off for the rest of this session, but I did want to at least put it on and say hi, and you can, see what I look like. Let's go ahead here. So I am going to be starting out with talking to you all about deciding whether or not you would like to become a nonprofit. This is something that a lot of people kind of battle with, right? With wanting to know if 501c3 is worth it, how much is it going to cost, that sort of thing. But what are the advantages and disadvantages, right? Next slide. So I think we did have a poll for this. Is that correct, Miriam?
Yep, we can do that before you get started.
Yeah, that would be great. Basically, this poll is just asking where you are in your coalition journey. So we will be able to see what you answer. Everybody else will not know individually. But we really want to know where you're at. If you're not even considering, nonprofit status, if you're considering that, if you're like, just starting out, or if you are experts and you probably should be talking to us about it. And that will help us with guiding the conversation.
So I see that about a third of the group has responded to the poll. So please register your response if you can. And we're almost ready. I think I'm going to end the poll just about now. So it looks like most of the organizations represented do have nonprofit status or they're considering it. Just one, it's not applicable.
Awesome. That just helps us to know where, your questions lie. So a lot of you are already 501c3, but it looks about half of you maybe might not be. So some of the advantages that I've seen is being able to be eligible for public and private grants. That's the #1 reason why Appalachian Breastfeeding Network became a 501c3. But also you have that tax exemption. You have a formal structure, which you don't need a 501c3 to have a formal structure, but you also have that limited liability as well. Some of the disadvantages, though, might be cost. So you might need to think about where you're at in that process and whether or not you will be able to sustain that, which we'll be talking about sustainability later on in our TA sessions. But also it takes a lot of work. So, you have to have a dedicated team really to work on that. And everything is scrutinized by the public as well. So you have to be very, very transparent. And if you're not, we've seen some instances where, that kind of falls apart, right? Linda, do you have anything to add about advantages or disadvantages?
Well, first of all, I just want to mention, I put in the chat IRS documents because this is an IRS category, the 501c3. There are other categories of charitable organizations, nonprofits, and you need to explore what is right for you. But there's a lovely education series for nonprofits too. But when I'm working with a coalition, trying to think about whether or not to be a nonprofit, we start with, what do you want to do? You know, do you want to offer continuing education? Do you want to apply for grants? Do you want to, you know, do A, B, or C? And that's been helpful for them in discerning whether nonprofit status is really right for them.
Mhm. Yeah, and when I started jumping into this nonprofit world, I didn't realize that there's actually 29 different types of 501Cs. So 501c1 through 29. So you'd have to, kind of look at what really you fall into. But most of us, especially in the like breastfeeding coalition world, would fall into that 501c3 if that's something that you want to do. Not everyone has to or should. In my opinion, if you are, doing a lot of support groups or, breastfeeding education, and you don't want to step into the, grant funding world, then, do what works for your grassroots coalition. We need all of you, right? We need all of these organizations. So sometimes it may not be what, you want to do. But whenever you are choosing that type of nonprofit organization, there's different types within the 501c3 even. So there's associations, trusts, and corporations. And what we would be looking at if you are looking for grants, which I saw that in the questions a lot when you all registered, was just how do you apply for grants? And, we'll talk about that more in sustainability. But you have to make sure that you are the right type of nonprofit organization to be eligible for that. And most of the time that would be a 501c3 corporation. But we do have, these resource lists for you to look at to figure out which type of nonprofit organization really fits your bill the best. Linda, is there anything else that you can think of when you're just trying to consider whether or not you would like to be a nonprofit organization?
I also think about not only grants, but do you want to be able to receive donations?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to be a tax exempt organization? Are you selling things? Do you sell books? That can govern the status that you need to be if you sell t-shirts, if you sell items. So what do you want to do? And then figure out which is the right status. And then there are forms in the chat. I put the information from the IRS, which is federal, and then example Secretary of State's offices. So I'm from Minnesota and Stephanie's from Ohio. So we gave you 2 examples there of the Secretary of State's offices. But I'm really interested in the participants too. What sort of resources do you have? Please put that in the chat. Are there any specific questions to what we've covered so far?
Yeah, and Linda, you brought up a good point too about whether or not you want to sell something. Mm-hmm. So say you do sell t-shirts, that doesn't mean that you cannot be 501c3. You just would have to have that as a fundraiser. So it doesn't mean that you can't sell them. You just can't sell them for a profit. You have to be able to use them for your mission or your vision, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. But also when we are talking about the IRS, when you apply to become a nonprofit 501c3 through the IRS, that doesn't automatically make you a charitable donation organization. In some states, not all states, but in most states, you also have to register with their charitable donation organization as well, which is a separate application. And a lot of people don't know that, and they think that they can go ahead and get all the donations and people can write them off on their taxes, when that's you're like missing a step in between there.
Mm-hmm. Kara, thank you so much for putting in the chat the comment about your state nonprofit support. I put in the chat the National Council of Nonprofits and all the local affiliates. I would echo that. In Minnesota, we are members of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and we benefit tremendously from being a member of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits for technical assistance and trainings and templates and guidance. It's really an invaluable resource. So every state has some version of that Council of Nonprofits.
Absolutely.
Shall we, let's go to the next section really quick. Next slide.
Absolutely.
Oh, and I just want to comment, Heidi, thank you for putting in the chat the standards for excellence.org. That's one that we can add to our list. We have a list, a running list of all these resources, putting some of them in the chat. Some of them are still on that list. We can add some to the list, but that'll be available on the USBC website. So Stephanie, why don't you talk a little bit about the essential paperwork? And this is in the category of, we didn't have any questions about this, but it's because maybe you didn't know to ask about the paperwork.
Yeah, and I think whenever you start jumping in with both feet, whenever you're starting your nonprofit, maybe you don't think about some of the paperwork, or you don't know what is involved in that. So that may be a question that you had, but you didn't know, to write it down. So one of our favorite resources is the Community Toolbox, which comes out of Kansas, I believe. And so I think Linda's going to link that below, but it really does go into, what are bylaws and how do you write them? Because, a lot of us have lactation backgrounds, but we don't have really that governance background for a lot of us, right? But bylaws are basically written rules, and they talk about the internal affairs of your organization. And so generally it'll talk about, it'll define what your name is, what your mission and vision is, how you elect officers, what your board looks like, that sort of thing. And so you want to kind of look at some drafts. There's all kinds of them that you can look at. And I know that USBC also has some of their policies and procedures and bylaws and stuff like that available to look at online. But you can find a lot of different people, because when you are a nonprofit, transparency is really key. So you can find our bylaws on Appalachian Breastfeeding Network's homepage if you scroll all the way down to the bottom. So you can look at different people's and see what works for you. But you want to absolutely define what your organization is and what the purpose of that organization is, and always kind of fall back on that, right? And then it'll also define who can be, a board member, who's a member, when your meetings should take place, that sort of thing. And if your meetings are different with the board of directors than it is with the membership, that would also be in your bylaws as well. Another thing that you would have to write up is in articles of incorporation, and some states call that a charter. But basically, this is identifying the purpose of your organization. So write down the reason that you are forming that organization and what you are doing. And that also will include your board members' personal information as well. So just make sure that you have the primary contact on there. And these are necessary if you are going to be filing for a 501c3. So it's always good to have documentation of what your organization is doing and when meetings should be and stuff like that. But it's necessary if you are applying for a 501c3. Linda, do you have anything to add to that?
I think I was looking at the chat, so I'm not sure if you covered updating for equitable practices and language.
No, I didn't. That's a good.
So this is what I mean.
Yeah.
I have personal experience recently in Minnesota, and I see in the participants list the chair of our the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition Governance Subcommittee, who led the process of updating our bylaws, because we found that some of the language in our original bylaws from 2006 was holding us to some inequitable practices, like who had access to certain types of meetings, and how we elected certain positions or how we chose certain positions. And we needed to update just to stay with the times, but also as a chance to embed some inclusive language and inclusive practices into our bylaws to hold our own feet to these really important practices. So don't be afraid to update your bylaws. Don't be afraid to update your charters if you need to. So an example of change, thank you, Brenda. So for example, in the original bylaws, we had this thing called steering committee, and people had to be elected to the steering committee. And the steering committee over time became a part of the organization that really didn't have, since we grew and grew and subcommittees did a lot of the work, that steering committee didn't really have the function that we had intended it to have. It was actually becoming a part of our organization that was sort of a clique, you know, just Metro, just white, just lactation consultants. It wasn't diverse, it wasn't representative. So one thing we did was to retire that model, the steering committee, and we created a new way for members to join, and we embedded the practices into our bylaws of, we will have a representative council. It will represent different coalitions. It will intentionally represent the cultural and ethnic diversity of the state. And we will, you know, so we changed practices and had that change reflected in our bylaws, but also included language that requires us to have a certain level of representation.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense as an example.
Yeah, and not just that, I mean, that's a great example. And I also put some language recommendations and policies in the chat box, but I also wanted to say too, that having a policy in your bylaws, and like she said, don't be afraid to change them if you need to. But sometimes whenever these organizations were first built, they, you know, had, you know, where you could be elected unlimited amount of times, right? And we see a lot of the same board members over and over and over again in these organizations, right? And so if we can change some of these bylaws too, to say, hey, you know, we need a new chair every 2 to 4 years or something like that, and that person either can't run again or they can't run consecutively, then we're going to have new people coming into the board as well and making that more equitable as well. So those things are written out in your bylaws, but that doesn't mean that bylaws cannot be changed.
And then Brenda, you asked if Minnesota would share their bylaws. We would absolutely love to share our bylaws. We'll put it, I'll make sure that it's on our website and that there's access to our bylaws.
Yeah, and there's another question up there about like, how do you know when you're ready? I think if you're asking that question, you're ready. So if you are, you know, learning about this, you're here to get all of the information, you're asking the questions, that is, you know, the first step. And so I think just asking that question alone tells you that you're ready. It is some work, and but it also sounds like your situation, that there might be some, you know, I guess financial incentive for the other person. So if you feel as though you're ready, then I feel as though you're ready.
And I think checking in with your Council of Nonprofits, see if you can get a one-on-one conversation with your local or your state Council of Nonprofits or with Taproot can provide some guidance for your particular situation. You can have a longer conversation and really discern together the next steps.
Another thing that I wanted to bring up just really quickly is that when you are working on these bylaws and charters and articles of incorporation and you're not quite sure what all of this stuff is, a good place that you can tap into is maybe a local law school, and they can, kind of give you some of those pro bono, work and help you that way. And I know that that's some of the resources that we tapped into here in Ohio as well. So, that could be something that you could think about doing, because not all of us are going to be, governance experts, right?
Exactly. Let's go to the next section. Good. So we're going to talk about organizational direction, and Miriam, you can go to the next slide. I know there's a poll attached to this, but first of all, I just want to mention there are all sorts of resources for helping you create your mission and vision statements. That's one of those first activities that you do well before you even become a nonprofit. It helps define who you are, where you're going to go, what your niche is, what may need to be. And don't be afraid to update the mission and vision statement. We have some good resources. And Stephanie, if you want to add these, the resources on inclusive language. Also, there are some resources on developing mission and vision statements. Thank you. So that lovely community toolbox, which Stephanie and I both love. There's all sorts of guidance for developing mission and vision statements, and you've probably done this with other organizations. One thing I want to ask about is mission creep. That was a question that came up during the registration process, and when we were discussing this TA session, all of us had examples of mission creep. And mission creep is, to define it, it is when there's a shifting away or an expansion of your objectives as an organization over time. And it could be moving you away from your original mission or expanding beyond your original mission. And that can be a hazard for some organizations. It can kind of spread you too thin or move you in directions that are contrary to really what your niche is. I mean, potentially it could expand your work into new and exciting directions, but we just want to know, what's your experience with mission creep? So I'm going to launch this poll, and I don't know if we need to go to the next slide, Miriam, but we really want to know, what is your experience with mission creep with your organization? Okay, so I'm seeing, about half of the people have responded. Need a few more of you to respond. Good. Okay, there we go. And I'm going to share the results. It looks like just about half have never really heard of mission creep. This is the first time you've heard of mission creep, and maybe this will help you understand or spot potential mission creep in your organization. Some have heard of it, but it's not an issue. For some, it comes up, but not frequently, and for some, it comes up frequently. So we want to just, open up the chat section for some thoughts about mission creep and developing mission and vision, but also adhering to your mission and vision. And Stephanie, I'm wondering if you had an example. I know Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition, we've definitely had an example come up of trying to avoid mission creep. Stephanie, did you have one?
Yeah, so our mission at Appalachian Breastfeeding Network is to increase access to care, basically. And so sometimes, we get requests to, go to perhaps a nutrition conference that isn't going to talk about lactation, is not going to talk about what our grassroots mission is. And unfortunately, we have to decline some of those things, even though we want to be involved in all the things, right? But then when it becomes beyond our mission, then we are, experiencing that mission creep. So we have to be really careful about, accepting everything all the time, even though we get really excited, right? And I know, Linda, you have a really good example of that too.
Yeah, and I have two examples. Actually, one example is for Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition. We do a lot of continuing education, and we're supporting those lactation professionals and lactation advocates who are out in the field. And we support coalitions of all types across the state. We're not really designed to do research or lead research. So often grants will come up that are purely research that we've had to decline. When we can position ourselves as a subject matter expert and participating on a research project in a way that adheres to or aligns with our mission, for example, collecting qualitative information from community groups, that makes a lot of sense. But being the lead on a purely research project, it just feels it's too far from our original mission, and so we do have to decline. So it's but I want to just comment on another way that we might have to update our mission. An example is Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition. We just updated our mission a couple of years ago, and we added something. So we had a mission of providing continuing education, and this actually was more in our objectives, sort of those subpoints under the mission, providing continuing education, working with public health partners and everything. We didn't really have anything in our mission about diversifying the medical lactation workforce. So, but over time, we realized that that is an essential activity of what we can do to support everybody in reaching their breastfeeding and chest feeding goals. So we added that support for diversifying medical lactation workforce. So we've learned things over time, and I'm just wondering if anybody wants to add to the chat some comments about mission and vision, if they've had to make some changes in mission and vision, if they've experienced some mission creep that they've had to rein in, or maybe it's kind of opened up new venues for them and they've had to maybe change their mission to include that.
Yeah, and I was thinking about another example with us. If you are working with a specific group of people, so of course Appalachian Breastfeeding Network is about Appalachia, right? But we might have somebody that applied for a scholarship that is in California. We do some digging with the person, and if they do, like, they're originally from Appalachia, then that might be different because they have migrated to somewhere else, and they still have our culture, but in a lot of cases, we have to turn down some of these scholarships, even though it sounds like a wonderful, application, right? So it's always looking back to that mission. We are trying to, increase access to care in Appalachia, right? And that's some of the things that, unfortunately, our hands are tied with sometimes.
Assuming, and we don't like to assume, but hoping that mission and vision statements are developed by collectives. So they're developed by a group of people, particularly a group of people that's representative of the broader community. When you are adhering to your mission and vision statements, you're adhering to that group's values and their vision of the organization and their desire for what the organization does. So maybe a couple people will be making those decisions about which grants to pursue or which scholarships to award. But hearkening back to the mission and vision statements, you're recalling the words and intentions of that representative group. Let's go to the next section.
So we did have a lot of questions about board, right? And, where to kind of draw the line between board versus staff. And if you have employees, if it's time to get employees, if you have contractors, and, other ways that we can kind of harness that people power. So I'd love for you all to go to the chat and just let us know, are you just a volunteer board? Do you not have a board yet at all? Perhaps you're looking at employees versus contractors. This is something that we're kind of on the verge of investigating ourselves here at Appalachian Breastfeeding Network. So we operate a 24-hour hotline, and it is funded by a grant from the Ohio Department of Health, right? And right now, everyone is contracted with the Appalachian Breastfeeding Network. We don't have any employees at this time. And one of the big things that we looked at was sustainability of those funds, right? Once the grant is over, we won't have those funds anymore. And then therefore we won't, be able to have employees anymore. So it could be a temporary employee sort of thing, but all of the amount of money from the grant we thought could be better used if we had contractors versus employees. So I really think that it really just has to do with your organization and what works best for you. But also think about conflict of interest, which kind of came up in one of our meetings before this is, if you are on the board, can you be a contractor as well? And most of the time that is a conflict of interest. However, you have to think about your organization and your region as well, and who you have to be able to do these sorts of things. And so if you only have a certain pool of people that you can contract and those sort of things, so it gets kind of clear as mud, which is what I said in our meeting before, but it really, really just has to do with what your organization is doing and what capacity in which your 501c3 can hold it up and sustain it. And thankfully, we have a TA session later on down the road about sustainability. And that one is one that I'm super interested in as well. So Linda, do you have anything?
Just a comment about board versus staff. And this is something the organization that I work with, we review periodically. Just a little background, Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition was all volunteer until a couple of years ago. We had contractors, short-term, part-time contractors to coordinate an event or do something. I was a contractor, I was a grant writer, and then when the organization wanted to have their first executive director a couple of years ago, they asked me to step into that role, which is why I'm interim, but I am doing that as an employee. So we have an employee and several contractors, but we still have to define the difference between board. Board is the one that casts the vision. They make the decisions. I talk about they discern, they decide, and they deliberate. So they're the one processing all of the activities. What is the vision? Where are we going? The board is the one that supervises the employee, the ED. Staff are those contractors in the ED. They do day-to-day operations. They're going to be the ones who are working on a project, setting up a conference, creating t-shirts to sell as part of the mission. They do the day-to-day operations. Just looking at the chat section, thank you, Stephanie, for putting those definitions and those resources in the chat section. And there's, yes, learning the difference between a governance board and a working board. So there's evolutions of board. And my understanding, and so Kara, I'm just going to go with my understanding of governance board and working board, and Stephanie, please chime in. Oh, I think no, you haven't done that already. that a working board is going to be doing more of the activities of the organization. They're going to be making decisions, but also doing some of the activities of the organization. The governance board is more removed, and they provide more leadership and a bigger vision for the organization. And that organization may have more staff or more people, boots on the ground, to actually do the work, the actually day-to-day activities. So Stephanie, do you have a finer understanding of governance board versus working board?
Yeah, so it's kind of similar to what you said was the difference between board versus staff, except governance board and working board are both non-paid. So the working board is what's doing, the work, and governance is basically those that govern over that. So in Appalachian Breastfeeding Network, we have an executive board, but we also have just a regular board. We don't really have a name for it, just other than other board members. And so our executive board is like our president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, all of those people. And then our working board is our state representatives and our state alternates and our publicity chair and media chair and stuff like that, that are actually doing the work. We also have committees as well that kind of gives us this balance of checks and balances, where we have an equity committee that is comprised of members but not of other board members, that also kind of look at the things that the board is putting out and doing. So we have kind of like the circular thing going on where everybody is giving each other that checks and balances. So it's not a one person show. And that was one of the questions on here as well. Can a nonprofit be a one-person show? And so no, it should not be. You should have a board, because this is a public entity now. So it's not just one person. And so one of the things that was brought up in one of my talks before about nonprofits was founder syndrome. How do we stay away from that? And basically, if you've never heard of what founder syndrome is somebody that, had founded the organization always being there, right? And always, even if they aren't still on the board or a part of this organization, if they're in the room, people are going to look at them, right? And kind of say, what does Stephanie think about this? Because she founded the organization. And very often I even have to kind of sit back in my chair in a board meeting and say, this isn't the Stephanie Breastfeeding Network. This is the Appalachian Breastfeeding Network. What do you all think? I need your voices. And things like that, right? So trying to avoid, that founder syndrome of always being the person on top, because it becomes very elitist at that point, right? And that you go away from your mission, right? And then you're experiencing that mission creep, and it all kind of blends together. Linda, do you have anything to?
I just want to point to Cicely's resource at the Center for Nonprofit Management. And so thank you so much. We're going to put that in our resource list. We're coming to the end of time. I just want to comment, and Miriam, feel free to advance the slide. I just want to comment. We have a whole lot of resources on this resource list, but another collection of resources are your fellow coalitions. I know when NBC was trying to update and try to figure out how do we change how we recruit board members, we had a long conversations with the folks in California because they had just done that. And when we've tried to figure out some more things, we've had conversations with like the Oklahoma Breastfeeding Coalition or other coalitions. So know that these are all resources, but your fellow coalitions of all types and sizes are excellent resources for you too. Organization in California, Toman, that was, I talked to Robbie with the California Breastfeeding Coalition because they had just developed some new resources for recruiting board members. And we adopted some and adapted them. And we have the most diverse board we have ever had now. And it's really exciting. Miriam, why don't you talk about the resources? And I want to say thank you so much for everybody and for participating. This has been wonderful. Thanks for coming. Thanks for stepping into our office for office hours.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. I do see that we're at time, so I'll try to be quick. Like Linda said, we have a number of resources. These are on the USBC website. We also want to mention BoardSource here, which is another one that everyone can use if you are a member of the USBC. And if you have any questions about membership, I have the email on here. And more, we do have a satisfaction survey. We will be sharing that. Thank you, Nakia. So if you can go ahead and participate in that, that helps us, continue to do these sessions, see what is working and what is needs to be adjusted. And please stay tuned for our next sessions. As we mentioned, this is part 1 of 4, and our next one will be the communications topic. This will be January 11th, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much to our speakers, Linda and Stephanie. Thank you for everyone participating in the chat box. I see some people are sharing email addresses, which is great. As we said, this is a peer sharing space, and thank you all for joining us. Now keep it open just for one more second to keep an eye on this chat box. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your days.